A young mother was found dead in her own home, and from the very first days of the investigation, detectives felt the answer was right there in plain sight. But the deeper they dug, the more strange and puzzling details they uncovered. And when they finally got to the truth, it turned out to be so unexpected it shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Sarah Williamson was born on June 20, 1963, in Florida. Her father served in the Army, so for a time, the family lived on a military base before eventually settling in Albuquerque, New Mexico. At school, Sarah stood out right away, especially in math. It later turned out her IQ was exceptionally high, and she earned top grades with very little effort. She also loved to read, gravitating towards crime novels, and by her later high school years she was already thinking about writing one of her own. She was also energetic and outgoing, had plenty of friends, and loved spending time with her older sister. After graduating, she enrolled at a university not far from Albuquerque and earned a degree in mathematics. While she was studying, she met a man named Cohen, and once they both finished their degrees, they got married. Sarah had planned to continue on to a master's in statistics, but she received a very attractive job offer at a military base. After working there for a while, she and her husband moved to Maryland, where she landed a position as a statistical analyst with the National Security Agency. It was a major leap in her career, and Sarah quickly proved herself as a talented problem solver who could take on challenges of any size. Around that same time, she began writing her own crime novel about a statistician who solves a murder. 3 years into her marriage, Sarah's relationship with her husband started to fall apart, and eventually, they decided to get a divorce. She kept working at the NSA and also decided to finally pursue her master's in statistics. Sarah enrolled in evening classes at Johns Hopkins University where she met another student named Lorenzo. At the time she was 27 and he was 25. Lorenzo was working towards a degree in business and finance, and like Sarah, he had already been married once before. The two started dating, and after Sarah completed her master's, she married him. They settled in a well-off neighborhood called Elkridge, just outside Baltimore. 3 years later, they had a son, but almost immediately after his birth, Lorenzo began to pull away from the family. His behavior changed drastically. He became controlling of Sarah's every move and showed almost no interest in their child. Eventually, Sarah decided to file for divorce. Lorenzo moved back in with his parents, who lived nearby, and they agreed their son would spend weekends with him while living with Sarah the rest of the time. At the time, Sarah was 35, and her son had just turned 1. On Friday, November 13, 1998, she dropped him off at Lorenzo's house, then spent the next day with her best friend, Laura. The following morning, Sunday, Laura woke up expecting a call from Sarah, because they had planned to talk, but Sarah never called. Laura tried contacting her, but she didn't answer. That's when Laura noticed she had a voicemail waiting. It had been left at 8:46 p.m. the night before, while she was already asleep. Back then, voicemail didn't show who had called unless you dialed in to listen. Still, Laura figured it might be from Sarah and pressed play. To her horror, she heard chaos on the line, strange noises, then a woman screaming, followed by the sounds of a violent struggle. It sounded like someone was being attacked in real time. Shaken, Laura immediately contacted police. She asked them to check on Sarah, and officers were dispatched to her home. The first thing they noticed was that the window next to the front door had been shattered, yet the door itself was locked, and no one came when they knocked. Circling around, they found the sliding glass door at the back unlocked and went inside. What stood out immediately was that the alarm system on that door was still armed, which made little sense. If someone had broken in through the front, the alarm should have gone off. When they entered the living room, they were met with a gruesome sight. Sarah's body lay sprawled on the floor in a massive pool of blood. The walls, furniture, even the ceiling were also splattered with it. Fearing the worst, officers hurried through the rest of the house, searching for Sarah's baby. Not knowing he was with his father, they immediately assumed he might have been kidnapped. Sarah's body was sent to the medical examiner, while detectives focused on processing the crime scene. They quickly determined that the killer had most likely entered through the broken front window. That window was also wired to the alarm system, but the sensor was on the frame, so it would only trigger if the window was opened. Smashing the glass didn't set it off. Bloody fingerprints showed that the intruder also used the same window to leave. Inside, investigators noticed something strange. Someone had pulled out all the VHS tapes from a drawer in the living room and scattered them across the floor. And the VCR itself was missing. In the kitchen, every cabinet door had been thrown open. Like someone was searching for something specific. At first glance, it looked like a burglary, but detectives quickly started to doubt that theory. Sarah's laptop and wallet were sitting untouched on the kitchen table. It felt more like someone had staged the scene to look like a break-in, covering up a much darker motive. The autopsy only reinforced that suspicion. Sarah had been stabbed repeatedly with wounds across her entire body. The sheer level of violence suggested deep, personal anger or hatred toward her. Detectives also couldn't figure out why the killer chose to smash the front window. The back of the house faced the woods and would have offered a much safer way in without drawing attention. That led them to believe the attacker might have known exactly how the alarm system worked, and realized that breaking the back door glass would have likely triggered it. Forensics didn't find any usable fingerprints or solid evidence. All they could do was gather up the huge amounts of blood left behind, hoping that somewhere in the mess, they might pick up traces of the killer's DNA if he'd cut himself during the brutal attack. Meanwhile, officers searched the backyard and discovered a machete, which they believed was the murder weapon. Forensics later confirmed that the wounds on Sarah's body matched it exactly. While experts worked through the evidence, detectives confirmed that Sarah's little boy was safe with his father. With that worry off the table, they turned their focus to interviewing Sarah's friends and family. They wanted to know if she'd had any conflicts leading up to her death, but everyone said the same thing. Sarah was kind, easygoing, and never fought with anyone. The only exception was her ex-husband, Lorenzo. Sarah's best friend, Laura, explained to investigators that the divorce had been rough. After their son was born, Lorenzo's behavior completely changed. He had been on antidepressants before, but stopped taking them once the baby arrived. From then on, Sarah noticed he showed no interest in spending time with her son. But that wasn't all. Lorenzo also grew controlling, watching her every move. Over time, Sarah started to feel like he was angry at her for giving more attention to their newborn than to him. Sometime later, after Sarah went back to work, Lorenzo started accusing her of having an affair with her boss. He even showed up at her workplace. Since she worked for the NSA, his accusations triggered a full-scale internal investigation and interviews with dozens of employees. In the end, investigators found absolutely no evidence to back up his claims. Still, Lorenzo refused to let it go. During one of their fights, he even pulled a gun on Sarah. That was the breaking point, and she filed for divorce. When Lorenzo found out about it, he tried to hit her while she was holding their baby. Sarah fell, and Lorenzo snatched the child and walked out. He dropped the baby off at his parents' house. Then came back and told Sarah she had to sleep with him, or she'd never see her son again. After that, Sarah went straight to the police and got a restraining order against him, but no other action was taken. From then on, she only saw him in court, where they were battling over custody, or when she dropped their son off at Lorenzo's parents' house on weekends, since the court ruled he had visitation rights. At one point, Lorenzo even tried to get a passport for his son so he could take him out of the country. But the court shut that down. Sarah's sister later revealed that just one day before the murder, Sarah had called her and said she was genuinely afraid of Lorenzo. She was worried he might hurt her before the court made a final decision about custody of their son. Sarah even asked her sister to look after the child if anything ever happened to her, because she didn't want Lorenzo raising him. That alone was enough for detectives to take a closer look at Lorenzo, so they went to speak with him. When they told him Sarah had been found dead, he dropped to his knees, covered his face with his hands, and started screaming. Once he calmed down, investigators began asking questions. Lorenzo denied any involvement and insisted they should look into her boss, claiming Sarah had been having an affair with him. As for himself, he said he was at home. Knight and his whole family backed him up. Detectives knew that kind of alibi wasn't rock solid. Family members could easily be covering for him. They took his DNA and fingerprints and also checked him for any scratches that might have come from a struggle, but he didn't have a single mark on him. They then got a warrant to search Lorenzo's house and car, but once again came off empty. No blood, no shoes matching the prints left in Sarah's house, and no other evidence that could tie him to the crime. In the end, Lorenzo hired a strong defense attorney, which forced detectives to shift their focus. They decided to check out Sarah's former boss, but by then he had already left the NSA and moved away. When the NSA learned about Sarah's murder, they decided to assign their own team to investigate the case alongside local police. They reached out to Sarah's former boss, and once again, he insisted that their relationship had been strictly professional. He also said that on the night of the murder he was having dinner with friends in another state, and that alibi checked out. With no other real leads, detectives tried to squeeze more information out of the voicemail Sarah had left her friend in the middle of the attack. They were hoping to catch the killer's voice, but instead, they picked up something else. After experts cleaned up the recording, investigators thought they could hear Sarah screaming the name Mike. That immediately raised a red flag, because Lorenzo's brother was named Michelangelo, but he went by Mike. He lived in the same house with Lorenzo and their parents, and according to him, he'd been home the night Sarah was killed. Detectives started wondering if Mike might have carried out the murder himself, maybe to make sure the child stayed in their family. They brought him in for questioning and played the enhanced tape for him, but he said he couldn't hear his name on it at all. And to be fair, the theory was shaky from the start, because even on the cleaned-up version, the recording was so unclear that you couldn't make out any distinct words. Mike denied having anything to do with the murder, but during questioning, detectives noticed he was visibly shaking. And when they drove him back home, the moment he stepped out of the car, he immediately threw up. It all looked suspicious, so the lead detective gave him his phone number and told him to call if he ever decided to come clean. But instead, Lorenzo's attorney reached out to police and said that from now on, they'd only be allowed to speak to his brother in the presence of a lawyer. After that, detectives checked out Sarah's first husband as well as Lorenzo's ex-wife, but both were cleared. As for Lorenzo's ex-wife, investigators asked if she'd be willing to help them, and she agreed. Police tapped her phone and she called Lorenzo, carefully trying to coax something new out of him, but he stuck to his original story and kept insisting he had no idea who killed Sarah. There was also another theory tied to Sarah's job at the NSA. She had access to classified information, and detectives couldn't rule out that this might have been a motive. But the special team from the NSA looked into it and ultimately concluded there was no connection between her work and the crime. A month after the murder, the lab finally finished processing all the evidence from Sarah's house, and they found DNA from an unidentified man in 3 different blood samples. Detectives immediately compared it to Lorenzo's DNA, and to their surprise, it wasn't a match. The same went for his brother and his father. The blood didn't belong to any of them. This twist shocked investigators, who had been almost certain Lorenzo was involved. But now, with the DNA pointing to a completely different man, his guilt didn't look so clear anymore. The problem was, without any other leads, there was no way to figure out who the real killer was, and the case went cold for months. Detectives kept digging, even checking known serial offenders in the area, but nothing came of it. Later, they sent the voicemail recording to the FBI, where experts were able to clean it up more effectively. Turned out, Sarah hadn't said Mike at all. It was just a scream. That went on for 7 months, until the case suddenly took a shocking turn. On June 1, 1999, the lead detective got a call from the Baltimore County Police Department. An officer there explained that one of their inmates had just confessed to killing Sarah. The inmate was a 19-year-old named Ardell Tickles, who'd been arrested 3 months earlier for an armed robbery at a McDonald's. While sitting in jail awaiting trial, he told his cellmate that he'd murdered a woman in her own home. The cellmate quickly struck a deal with prosecutors, wore a wire, and started asking Ardell for details about the killing. Ardell explained how he'd broken into the house through a window and attacked the victim with a machete. He described her injuries with such precision that detectives had no doubt he was talking about Sarah. He even gave the exact date it happened, the night she was killed. Ardell bragged about how his victim died while he kept striking her, saying he wanted her to suffer as much as possible. Finally, when his cellmate asked why he'd done it, Ardell gave an answer that floored detectives. He said a former coworker had paid him $5,000 to kill her. Investigators were convinced he wasn't lying about being the killer. His confession included details that had never been released to the public. The lead detective headed straight to the jail to confront him. He told Ardell he'd be facing first-degree murder charges and made it clear that they already had his confession on tape, so he'd better start talking. Ardell didn't deny a thing. He admitted he had killed the woman without even knowing her name. He added that he didn't feel any remorse, because according to him, Sarah was a bad person. He claimed the former coworker who hired him for the job told him that Sarah once pushed a pregnant black woman down a flight of stairs and spit in her face. Ardell also said that instead of the promised $5,000, he only got $3,000, but the money didn't matter to him as much as punishing her for what she'd supposedly done. At that point, the detectives laid out 3 photos, Lorenzo, his brother, and his father, and asked Ardell which one of them had hired him. To his surprise, Ardell didn't recognize any of them. He explained that the person who hired him wasn't a man at all, but a woman, though he didn't know her name. That raised even more questions. How could he have worked with this woman and not even know who she was? And what kind of woman would want Sarah dead? One thing was clear though, this woman knew Sarah very well. According to Ardell, just days before the murder, she drove Ardell to Sarah's house and told him the best time to strike would be Saturday because Sarah would be home alone. She even explained how her alarm system was set up and warned him not to tamper with it so the neighbors wouldn't hear a thing. With this new lead in hand, detectives shifted their focus to finding the woman behind it all. Ardell had worked at a nursing home laundry in Baltimore, so police pulled the employee roster, hoping he'd recognize someone. But what they stumbled across was far more shocking. One name on that list instantly told them who the mysterious woman was. Her name was Amelia, and she was Lorenzo's mother. Detectives went back to the jail and showed Ardell a photo of Amelia. Without hesitation, he confirmed that she was the one who had hired him. What really stunned him, though, was learning that Amelia wasn't just some stranger. She was Sarah's mother-in-law. He explained that Amelia often brought the little boy to work, and he'd assumed she was just the child's babysitter. When he realized that the boy was actually Sarah's son, Ardell was floored. He said the only reason he agreed to the murder was because he believed Sarah was racist, and he thought he was punishing her for that. But now he understood he'd been manipulated from the very start. Of course, there was no one doing what he had already done. And for detectives, the real challenge was still ahead. Ardell's confession alone wasn't enough to put Amelia away. They needed hard evidence to prove she'd orchestrated the murder. Talking to staff at the nursing home, detectives found a woman willing to cooperate in exchange for full immunity. She told them that on the day of the murder, Ardell had asked her to help him become a killer by renting a car for him, since he was too young to do it himself. She thought he was joking and went along with it. But just a few hours after she handed over the rental, Ardell brought it back and his boots were covered in blood. He told her he had just gotten rid of the devil and asked for her help. They drove out to a vacant lot where they burned his bloody boots. On their way back to the car, 2 officers stopped them. The cops searched the vehicle and even found a knife under the seat with blood on the handle. But instead of arresting both of them, they simply took the knife and left. Digging deeper, detectives also discovered that just weeks before the murder, Sarah's mother-in-law had withdrawn $2,500 in cash. Soon after, Ardell deposited nearly the exact same amount into his own bank account, a connection that was hard to ignore. Lab experts compared Ardell's DNA with the sample found on the machete, and it was a perfect match. That was enough to charge him with murder, and right after that, detectives went after Amelia. She was brought into the station, where she called Lorenzo. She told him she was probably going to prison, and he didn't even ask what for. His reaction was strangely calm. After that, Amelia refused to answer any more questions and demanded a lawyer. Knowing that the evidence they had might not be enough to secure a conviction, the lead detective decided to bluff. He told her that if they uncovered proof Lorenzo knew about the murder, their family would never see the child
sat
again.
In that room for a
Amelia
few hours
sat in that room for a few hours before finally giving in.
She waived her right to an attorney.
She waived her right to an attorney and told detectives she was ready to confess.
She admitted that she had never really liked
Sarah and thought she was ungrateful. Things only got worse after the baby was born. Amelia believes Sarah wasn't raising him properly, but Sarah never listened to her. Over the next few months, the tension kept building, and their arguments became more and more frequent. When Sarah finally filed for divorce, Amelia panicked, afraid she'd never see her grandson again. And that's when she snapped. She wanted revenge, but insisted she never meant for Sarah to be killed. According to Amelia, she had casually mentioned her frustrations to Ardell at work, and he told her she needed to get back at Sarah for the disrespect. He even offered to help, promising to take care of it. Amelia claimed that Ardell told her he only planned to throw rocks at Sarah's house to scare her. Detectives doubted that version of events, especially since Amelia had paid him a large amount of money, far too much for something as petty as tossing a few stones. In the end, Amelia said no one else in her family, including Lorenzo, knew anything about her involvement. Investigators never found any evidence to prove otherwise, so prosecutors went ahead and sent the case to court. The first to stand trial was Ardell. He claimed Amelia had manipulated him, tricking him into killing an innocent woman. He even said he'd spent the past months praying for Sarah and her family. But the jury wasn't moved, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Amelia's trial began in January 2000, and not a single member of her family showed up. Her lawyer tried to argue there wasn't enough to directly tie her to the murder, but the evidence was stacked against her. In the end, she too was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. In 2009, she filed an appeal, claiming Sarah didn't deserve to die and that she had long since forgiven her. This questionable statement had no effect, and the original sentence was upheld. As for Sarah's son, he continued living with his father. Lorenzo eventually remarried and had 3 more children. On February 8, 2023, he passed away at the age of 57. Amelia, now 89 years old, is still serving her life sentence. Ardell eventually became eligible for parole, but when he applied in 2024, his request was denied. He remains behind bars to this day. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A college student vanished from her friend's house in the middle of the night while the others were asleep in the next room. No one heard or saw anything unusual, but by morning she was gone. Police were called in right away, and the case instantly became the most talked about story in the city. Detectives chased down thousands of leads before finally uncovering the unexpected truth that shook the entire country to its core. Brianna Dennison was born on March 29, 1988, in Reno, Nevada. She grew up there with her parents and younger brother. Until, when she was 6, her father passed away unexpectedly. The loss hit the family hard, but it brought Brianna even closer to her mom, and she did everything she could to help. Her family also loved to travel. Brianna made it through half of Europe, visited Japan, and even spent a year in Italy on a student exchange program. After graduating high school, she headed to California to attend Santa Barbara City College. She'd always wanted to work with kids, so she set her sights on becoming a child psychologist. In Santa Barbara, she quickly found a circle of friends and started dating a guy. In the winter of 2008, 19-year-old Brianna was on a college break and came back to Reno to spend time with her family and friends. On Friday, January 18th, she headed over to her best friend's house, planning to stay there for the weekend. Along with another friend, they had their days all planned out, skiing during the day, then attending concerts and nightclubs in the evenings. On Saturday, January 19th, Brianna was supposed to go to a concert by one of her favorite bands, but she came down with a cold. Still, her mom encouraged her to go anyway, so Brianna decided she didn't want to miss it. A few hours later, she left the concert a bit early to head back to her friend's house, hoping to keep her cold from getting worse. The house wasn't far, but it was freezing outside and she didn't want to walk. She spotted a car pulling out of the parking lot and asked the driver for a ride. He agreed and she made it home, where she started waiting for her friends to get back from the concert. They showed up around 3:30 in the morning. The girls chatted for a bit before heading to bed. Around 4:30, Brianna sent a text to her boyfriend and then fell asleep. Her friends were sleeping in the next room while Brianna had crashed on the couch in the kitchen. But around 9 a.m., when they got up and started making breakfast, Brianna was gone. At first, they didn't think much of it, figuring she'd just moved into the bedroom, which had the doors shut. About 40 minutes later, one of them knocked on that bedroom door to wake her up for breakfast, but there was no answer. She knocked again, still nothing. Finally, she opened the door and found out that the room was empty. The friends searched the entire house and quickly realized Brianna wasn't anywhere, but all of her things, her phone, purse, clothes, even her shoes, were still there. The whole thing felt wrong. It was below freezing outside, and they couldn't imagine any reason she would walk out in just a t-shirt. They called her mom, but she had no idea where her daughter could be. She rushed over right away. And in the meantime, the friends spotted something deeply unsettling. On the pillow where Brianna had been sleeping, there were a few small reddish stains, looking an awful lot like blood. Panicked, her friends called the police, and officers were on the scene almost immediately. They didn't find any signs of a struggle inside the house, but a few things stood out right away. The blanket Brianna had been sleeping under was lying several feet away from the couch, and the stuffed teddy bear she'd been using as an extra pillow was missing. There were no signs of forced entry either, but the friends told police they never locked the front door, which just so happened to be right in front of where Brianna had been sleeping. From the very first hours, detectives started leaning towards the theory that she'd been abducted. It seemed unlikely she would have walked out into the freezing cold in just a t-shirt, but they still couldn't figure out how someone could have taken her without waking the two other girls sleeping in the next room. Forensic experts soon came up with the most plausible explanation based on the pillow Brianna had been using. First, they confirmed the blood on it was hers. Then they determined that the killer had likely pressed her face into the pillow with enough force to keep her from making a sound. The crime lab also swabbed the front door handle and found DNA belonging to an unknown man, someone who wasn't in the system. With no other useful clues inside the house, police launched a massive search across the city. They also began going door to door in the neighborhood, asking men to voluntarily provide DNA samples. Meanwhile, detectives dug into Brianna's phone and found a string of messages from her boyfriend. On the night she vanished, he had sent her multiple insults, and her friends said the two were on the verge of breaking up. Investigators briefly considered him a suspect until they confirmed he was in another state at the time and couldn't have been involved in the abduction. From the very first days, Brianna's disappearance became the biggest news story in the city. And soon, it spread across the entire country. Her photo was plastered on billboards and local media ran constant updates on the case. In total, police collected around 3,000 DNA samples from local residents, but the city's crime lab simply couldn't handle that kind of workload. Authorities turned to the public for help, quickly raising $150,000 to cover additional testing. Eventually, experts managed to process every single sample, but not one of them matched the DNA of the suspected abductor. Soon, the FBI joined the investigation, focusing their efforts on finding the suspect. Detectives first looked into the man who had given Brianna a ride home that night, suspecting he might have returned later to abduct her. After the media reported that police wanted to speak with him, the man came forward, provided a DNA sample, and presented a solid alibi, clearing him from their list of suspects. Another lead came from a man who lived directly across the street from Brianna's friend's house. He told police that he hadn't been sleeping that night and was sitting in his living room. Around 5 a.m., he noticed a shadow pass in front of his window, followed by the sound of someone trying to open his front door. After several failed attempts, the noise stopped. At first, he didn't think much of it, assuming it was just someone drunk who had mistaken his house for their own. With each passing day, the search efforts grew. Volunteers joined the police, helicopters scanned the area from above, and officers with search dogs combed through hard-to-reach places like forests, fields, and drainage ditches. But none of it led anywhere. Based on the evidence they had, detectives doubted this was the suspect's first crime. They began digging into the unsolved cases in Reno and soon found two incidents that caught their attention. In November 2007, just a few months before Brianna vanished, an unknown man attacked a 21-year-old college student. She was in a parking lot when he ran up, knocked her to the ground, pulled a gun, and assaulted her. He told her to keep quiet, but instead, she screamed at the top of her lungs. That seemed to scare him off, and he took off running, dropping a pack of condoms in the process. A month later, another attack happened. This time, the victim was a 22-year-old student standing outside her home when a man ran up from behind and covered her mouth and nose, causing her to lose consciousness. She woke up in the cab of a pickup truck. A few minutes later, the driver pulled over and sexually assaulted her, ordering her not to look at him the entire time. When he was done, he drove her back to her house and told her not to turn around as she walked to the door. She went straight to the police and gave a partial description. It was a white male, heavy-set, with tanned arms. She also described his pickup truck, adding one chilling detail. Inside, there was a child's shoe. There was another disturbing link between the two attacks. In both cases, the attacker took the victim's underwear with him. Investigators collected DNA from both women, and the samples matched each other. Now, detectives working Brianna's case requested a comparison with the sample from the door handle, and it came back as a match. This confirmed their worst fear. They were dealing with a serial predator who targeted women for actual assault. Once this information hit the news, another student came forward. She told police that one night someone had tried to break into her home, yanking on the front door handle so hard it actually bent. But whoever it was didn't manage to get inside. Using the description from the other two victims, police put together a composite sketch and a profile of the suspect, a man of average height, between 28 and 40 years old, with a solid, muscular build. His portrait was sent out to local newspapers and TV stations, along with a public plea for help identifying him. Panic began to spread through Reno. People realized there was a serial predator operating right under their noses and feared it was only a matter of time before he struck again. Gun and pepper spray sales skyrocketed, and women were terrified to stay home alone. But even with the public's intense pressure, investigators still weren't any closer to making an arrest or finding Brianna. With each passing day, hope that she might be alive grew dimmer. Divers were sent to search the local river for her body, joined by hundreds of volunteers braving the free and cold. Police also received over 5,000 tips, but not a single one brought them any closer to finding Brianna. This went on for almost a month, until police finally got a call. On February 15th, a worker was heading out for his lunch break. To save some time, he decided to cut through an abandoned lot on his way to a cafe. As he walked, he spotted a discarded Christmas tree lying in a ditch, and noticed a pair of socks sticking out from behind it. When he got closer, he saw what looked like a human figure. At first, he thought someone had dumped a mannequin, but it didn't take long for him to realize it was a body, and he immediately called police. Detectives sent the remains to the medical examiner to confirm the identity and determine the cause of death. The victim was completely naked except for socks, and lying next to the body were two pairs of women's underwear. The examiner confirmed it was Brianna. She had died from strangulation, and based on marks on her neck, the killer had used underwear to do it. According to the pathologist, Brianna was murdered inside the house, and her body was later taken away. This meant she had been dead since the very day she disappeared. As for the underwear, one pair belonged to Brianna's friend, who hadn't even realized they were missing, but the second pair wasn't hers. Detectives believe the killer deliberately left them at the scene to taunt police. Brianna had also been sexually assaulted, and male DNA was recovered from her body. As expected, it matched the samples from the two earlier assaults and the one found on the doorknob. The news of Brianna's body being found hit the entire city like a punch to the gut. Thousands of people had been following the case, clinging to the hope that she might still be alive. In the weeks that followed, police kept working to identify the killer, but every lead they chased ended in a dead end. A few weeks later, they decided to share more details with the public, revealing that the perpetrator seemed to collect his victim's underwear. Investigators hoped that maybe a relative or acquaintance had noticed something suspicious like that, but no useful tips came in. From that point on, the investigation all but froze, even though dozens of officers were still on the case. Weeks turned into months, and despite all their efforts, it was starting to feel like the killer had managed to get away with it. But everything changed on November 1st, almost a year after the murder. Police got a call from someone who wanted to stay anonymous. This person said that a while back, her friend found women's underwear in her boyfriend's pickup truck. When she asked him about it, his excuse sounded beyond suspicious. And there was more. Shortly after Brianna's murder, this man sold his pickup and left town. That man was 27-year-old James Bella, and police quickly turned their attention to him. James was a former Marine with extensive training in martial arts. At the time of Brianna's murder, he was working construction jobs and had spent a lot of time on projects near the university, right in the area where Brianna's friend lived. So he knew the neighborhood well. Digging deeper, detectives learned that James had a violent streak. His ex-girlfriend told them he had hit her multiple times and had once nearly killed someone with a knife. There was also an incident where, without any reason at all, he broke a dog's leg. Even with all that, James had never faced any charges, and police had never collected his DNA. Detectives soon learned he had already moved back to Reno, so they put him under round-the-clock surveillance. They also gave him a call, saying they wanted to talk. James agreed to meet, but didn't even bother asking what it was about. The next day, he sat down with detectives and they asked where he was on the night Brianna was killed. James claimed he had been at his girlfriend's place, but when they asked for a DNA sample, he flat out refused. Right after that, police went to his ex-girlfriend and she told them his alibi was a complete lie. He hadn't been with her that night. They also learned that James and this woman had a 4-year-old son together. Investigators asked the mother if they could take a DNA sample from the boy, and she agreed. Lab results showed the killer's DNA was a near-perfect match to the child's, which essentially meant someone in the boy's immediate family was responsible for the crimes. Now that they had all this evidence, detectives went back to James, but this time it was to arrest him. He was hit with a long list of charges connected to all 3 cases where his DNA had turned up. Still, he refused to admit any guilt. James was sent to jail to await trial, while investigators kept building their case. When they spoke with his father, they learned James had a long history of drug abuse, one of the main reasons he'd been kicked out of the Marines. Detectives also tracked down his old van, and testing showed that fibers from the seat covers were an exact match to fibers previously found on the clothing of another student who'd been kidnapped and driven home. His former employer had something to add as well. According to him, James quit his job the very same day Brianna's body was found and then took off to another state. When the trial began, James' attorney tried to argue that the cases weren't connected, that each crime had a different signature. But those claims didn't hold much weight, especially with the prosecution's long list of evidence tying James to every one of them. And it didn't help his case that during the proceedings, James kept smiling and even smirking. In late May 2010, just over 2 years after Brianna's murder, the jury found him guilty on all counts. That left the court to decide his sentence, and the death penalty was on the table. James' lawyer pushed hard to avoid the harshest punishment, telling the judge about his client's troubled childhood, how his alcoholic father would regularly beat him, and pointing out his good behavior in jail. None of that swayed the judge, and James was sentenced to death. Just a few months later, he picked up 4 additional life sentences for other charges, meaning that even if his execution never happens, which is entirely possible, he still has no chance of ever walking free. In the years that followed, James' lawyer tried several times to overturn the sentence, but each time the state's Supreme Court upheld the death penalty. As a result, James remains behind bars, with no set date for his execution. After his arrest, Brianna's family pushed for a new law in Nevada, requiring police to collect DNA from anyone arrested for a violent crime. They believed that if such a policy had been in place earlier, James would have been caught after his first attack on a student, and Brianna's life might have been spared. Tragically, her death wasn't the last blow to the family. Exactly 10 years after her murder, her 19-year-old cousin went missing and has never been found. She told her parents she was going to another state with a guy she'd recently met, and then stopped answering her phone. Her family fears something terrible happened to her, and they still hold out hope that one day she'll come home. A 20-year-old student woke up early to prepare for her studies and vanished under very bizarre circumstances. From the very beginning, there were many weird and conflicting leads, but despite the massive searches, she remained missing for 3 long years. Eventually, detectives made some progress in the case, but the more they uncovered, the more tangled the story became. Ultimately, her disappearance turned into one of the most mysterious cases in the state, and even after it was finally solved, many questions still linger. Holly Lynn Bobo was born on October 12, 1990 in a small American town called Darden, Tennessee. It was a quiet, peaceful place with just a few hundred residents far away from big cities. Holly lived there with her parents and older brother. The family loved spending time outdoors. They'd go hiking, fishing, and swim in the little creeks around town. Holly also had a passion for singing and often took part in her local church services. After high school, Holly decided to pursue a career in healthcare and become a nurse, so she enrolled in the University of Tennessee's campus in a neighboring town. By 2011, at the age of 20, Holly was dedicating most of her time to her studies. She also had a boyfriend. The couple had been dating since high school, and they were making big plans for their future together. Holly still lived with her parents since her university was only a few minutes' drive away. Plus, her father had built their home himself, and it meant a lot for the family, so Holly wasn't in any rush to move out. On April 13th, Holly woke up around 4:30 a.m. to get ready for class. A few hours later, her parents left for work, while her brother was still asleep. At about 7:30, Holly's boyfriend called her to tell her that he planned to go hunting on a large piece of land owned by Holly's grandmother and wanted to make sure her family wouldn't mind it. They chatted for a few minutes and Holly said she'd be leaving for university soon. A while later, one of Holly's neighbors stepped outside and was about to get into his car when he heard a piercing scream coming from the direction of her house. Thinking that something might have happened to a neighbor, he told his mother about what just happened and she called Holly's mom. Holly's mother tried to call her daughter, but Holly didn't pick up. Growing concerned, she decided to head back home to make sure everything was okay. Holly's brother, who was still asleep at the time, hadn't heard the scream, but shortly after, their dog in the backyard started barking loudly. That's when he decided to look out the window to see what was going on. Holly's brother looked out and saw her standing in the garage with a man beside her. He didn't recognize him because the man was wearing camouflage, but his first thought was that it might be Holly's boyfriend. The brother knew about his plans to go hunting on their grandmother's land, and he often wore camouflage. Since the garage was too far from his window, Holly's brother couldn't hear what they were talking about, but he could tell from her tone that she seemed upset. He decided to call his mom and ask if Holly was planning to go to class that day or if she'd invited her boyfriend over instead. But his mother interrupted him, yelling that the man wasn't her boyfriend. She then said something quite unexpected. She told him to grab a gun and shoot the man immediately. Shocked, he asked if she was serious and she replied, yes, before hanging up. When he looked back out the window, he saw Holly walking toward the woods near their property, with the man in camouflage holding her by the hand. This time, he noticed the man was much taller and broader than her boyfriend. At that moment, he was still confused about what was happening. He tried calling Holly, but she didn't answer. He also called her boyfriend, but he didn't pick up either. Meanwhile, their mom had already called the police. But since she was working in a neighboring county, the call was directed to a different police station. Soon after, her son called her back to tell her that Holly had walked into the woods with this man. He then grabbed his gun and went outside. But by then, Holly was nowhere in sight. However, he did notice splatters of blood inside the garage and immediately called the police. Officers arrived at the house within minutes, but by that time, there was no trace of Holly. Her brother showed them the blood in the garage and described the strange man he'd seen. Aside from the camouflage, the man was also wearing a cap, so he couldn't get a clear look at his face. Still, he remembered that the man had long, dark hair that reached down to his back. He also mentioned that he couldn't make out what Holly and the man were talking about, but he noticed the man had a fairly deep voice. The whole situation seemed strange to the police, but they didn't rush to start a full investigation. The local police department had very little experience handling cases like this, so they weren't sure what to do. In those critical first hours, they didn't search the woods, secure the house, or the blood-stained garage, or even talk to the neighbors. When Holly's parents returned home, they quickly realized that the officers weren't putting in any real effort to find the daughter. After repeated pleas from the family to begin a proper investigation, officers finally organized a search of the woods, spoke with neighbors, and brought in forensic experts to examine the blood in the garage. They also confirmed that Holly's boyfriend couldn't have been the man she was seen with. Besides the fact that her brother had noted the man looked very different, the police verified that her boyfriend was out hunting at the time of her disappearance. The search in the woods turned up nothing, so investigators requested GPS data from Holly's phone. It showed her moving north for about 30 minutes before heading back in the opposite direction. The last signal came from a spot in the woods, just a few hundred yards from her house. After that, the phone seemed to have been turned off. Police went to search that area and soon found the phone. Its SIM card was removed, but there was no sign of Holly herself. The search continued for several days, but led nowhere. Meanwhile, something strange started happening. People in their small town began finding Holly's belongings scattered around. First, someone found her lunch container on the street, then a receipt with her name on it. Another resident came across her school card. It was all pretty strange. But the police still couldn't figure out who was leaving these items. They considered that it might have been Holly herself, or maybe the person who took her. With no progress in finding Holly, investigators turned to the list of convicted criminals in the area. Soon, their attention shifted to a local man named Terry, who had multiple assault charges on his record. Digging deeper, they found that his victims shared striking similarities with Holly in both age and appearance. Terry also matched the height and build description of the man seen with Holly, so investigators began looking into his possible involvement in her disappearance. They obtained a warrant to search his home, but found no evidence. Next, they set up a wiretap, monitoring his calls and conversations for several weeks, but they still couldn't uncover anything that connected him to Holly's case. The investigators continued looking into other suspects and kept expanding their search area. With each passing week, more and more volunteers joined the effort. But despite their combined efforts, the search operations brought no results. For the next several months, there was barely any progress in Holly's case. Eventually, the police called off the ground search, shifting their focus entirely to investigating potential suspects. But this didn't lead anywhere either. Holly's family was devastated. They had no clue what had happened to her, where she might be, or if she was even alive. They also blamed the local police department, feeling the authorities hadn't put in enough effort, especially in those crucial first days. Looking back, the family realized the police had taken almost no action in the first 72 hours, which are often critical in missing persons cases. Despite their frustration, complaints, and constant push for a more active investigation, Holly's fate remained unknown. This went on for 3 years until something unexpected happened. In March 2014, police arrested a local man named Dylan, known to authorities for his involvement with illegal substances, on charges of unlawful weapon possession. During his interrogation, he made an unexpected confession, claiming he had seen Holly after she was abducted. According to Dylan, on the day of Holly's disappearance, he had gone to his brother Zach's house to pick up a car. When he entered the living room, he saw his brother, their mutual friend Jason, and another person, Holly. She was sitting in a chair, looking terrified. Dylan claimed that Zach told him he had kidnapped Holly, assaulted her, and even filmed it. As for what happened afterward, Dylan said only that she was killed soon after the abduction, insisting he had no part in the murder. He also mentioned that his brother had been wearing camouflage that day. The police brought Zach and Jason in for questioning, but both denied any involvement in Holly's disappearance. Investigators also searched their homes for any evidence or the alleged video of Holly's assault, but found nothing. Shortly after this, a woman contacted the police with another unexpected story. She claimed that she had previously lived with a man named Jeffrey, and one day he had shown her a clip from a video where a man assaulted a young woman. Jeffrey told her that the woman in the video was Holly and that the man doing that was Zach. He also mentioned that the video had been recorded by his brother. Detectives met with this woman and asked if she'd be willing to call Jeffrey while they recorded the conversation. She agreed, and during the call, she brought up the video. From Jeffrey's responses, detectives felt certain he really had shown her the recording. Shortly after, Jeffrey and his brother were both arrested. During questioning, both denied any involvement in Holly's disappearance and claimed not to know anything about the video. When detectives played Jeffrey the recording of his conversation with the woman, he said he had probably misunderstood her question. He added that his ex-wife's name was also Holly, suggesting he might have misinterpreted what she meant. The police searched the brothers' homes and examined all their devices, but were unable to find the video. They also found no evidence linking the brothers to the other 3 suspects. In the end, they had to release the brothers, as the witnesses' statement alone was not enough. However, as investigators continued trying to establish connections between these people and Zach, they uncovered another suspect. They found that a man named Shane had been in contact with Zach on the day of Holly's disappearance and decided to question him. They suspected that Zach might have asked him for help in disposing of the body, and during the interrogation, Shane confirmed that he indeed knew where Holly's remains were hidden. Detectives offered him full immunity in exchange for testifying against others involved and leading them to the body. Shane agreed, but for some reason he was ultimately unable to locate Holly's remains. In the end, the investigators revoked the deal and began considering other ways to obtain confessions or some new evidence against these suspects. While investigators were pursuing this lead, they received an unexpected call. In September 2014, a group of men went hunting in a forest about 19 miles from Holly's home. One of them spotted a large bucket hidden in the brush and decided to take a look. When he turned it over, he found a human skull and immediately reported it to the police. Forensic experts arrived on the scene and collected partial remains, which they sent to the lab for identification. Right away, detectives suspected these might be Holly's, and dental records quickly confirmed it. The remains had been out in the woods for 3 years, so finding out exactly what happened was nearly impossible. But one thing was certain, a bullet hole in the skull confirmed she'd been shot. Now, there was no question, Holly's death was a homicide. With the case now officially classified as a murder, detectives zeroed in on their 4 main suspects, Zach, his brother Dylan, their friend Jason, and their acquaintance Shane. The detectives decided to focus on Jason and brought him in for questioning. At first, he kept denying any involvement. So when the police told him that he could face a life sentence for murder, Jason agreed to testify against Zach. According to Jason, on the day of Holly's disappearance, he went over to Zach's house to buy drugs. Along with Zach, his brother and Shane were also there. They told him they had killed Holly and now needed to get rid of the evidence. Zach then showed him Holly's body, wrapped in a blanket, lying in the trunk of his car. Zach asked Jason to help dispose of the body, and he agreed. While Shane burned Holly's belongings in a barrel, he and Zach drove to the Tennessee River Bridge to throw her into the water. But when they pulled her out of the trunk, Zach realized she was still alive and shot her. Fearing the gunshot might attract attention, Zach quickly changed his plan. He put Holly's body back in the car and drove off to find another hiding place, dropping Jason off along the way. Sometime later, when Zach reached out to Jason, he mentioned he'd hidden Holly's body in the woods, but as it turned out, the location he described wasn't where her remains were actually found. Jason's story about the abduction also raised some questions. According to him, Zach, his brother, and Shane initially went to Holly's brother's house to teach him how to produce illegal substances. There, they saw Holly and apparently mentioned their plans to her. She became outraged, yelling at them to leave. Worried she'd exposed their illegal activities, the trio decided to abduct her. This version seemed odd for several reasons. First, Holly's brother claimed he had never been interested in making illegal substances and had never discussed it with any of the suspects. Second, when he woke up, he saw only one person with his sister, and that person didn't match Zach's description. The only one fitting what he remembered was Shane. Where the other 2 suspects were at that moment remained unclear. Jason also revealed that after abducting Holly, the 3 men took her to an old barn belonging to Shane's grandmother, where they assaulted her. It's worth mentioning that the check with Holly's name on it and her school card were found less than 100 yards from Shane's house. As for Zach and his brother, the police managed to find several pieces of circumstantial evidence linking them to the crime. Right after Holly's abduction, multiple neighbors reported seeing a white pickup speeding away from her house, and Zach owned a similar truck. His vehicle was also spotted by a surveillance camera near her home. Zach's ex-girlfriend told investigators that he had occasionally threatened her, saying something like, "I'll tie you up like Holly and no one will ever see you again." Several other witnesses claimed that he had told them, directly or indirectly, about his involvement in Holly's disappearance. Police also learned that Zach had threatened his brother, warning him that he'd end up in the same hole next to her if he cooperated with the investigation. Detectives also learned from a local resident that after the murder, Shane and Zach offered him a gun in exchange for illegal substances, and he accepted the deal. He later threw the weapon into the water, where police eventually recovered it. However, there were no fingerprints or DNA on it, so experts couldn't link it to the crime. As the prosecution prepared for trial, gathering all the evidence, the case took yet another unexpected turn. Shane, who had initially agreed to cooperate with the police but then failed to lead them to Holly's remains, was found dead in a hotel room. Authorities concluded he had done it himself, though the exact reason remained unknown. His lawyer blamed the investigators, insisting they had threatened Shane with a long prison sentence. The suspects' trials were held separately, starting with Zach's. His trial began in September 2017, 6 years after Holly's murder. Though Zach pled not guilty, Jason's testimony, along with other pieces of circumstantial evidence, weighed heavily against him. After a few weeks, the jury found him guilty of murder, sentencing him to life in prison, along with 2 additional 25-year terms for kidnapping and assault. In January the following year, Dylan went to trial. He decided to take a plea deal, admitting to helping with the kidnapping and murder, though the deal didn't require him to testify against anyone else or provide any specific details. He was sentenced to 35 years with no chance of parole. As for Jason, due to his cooperation, he received an 8-year sentence with the opportunity for early release. So, Holly's case was officially closed, but even after that, many questions remained. The prosecution lacked a single solid piece of evidence directly linking the suspects to her kidnapping. No fingerprints, DNA, or other evidence was ever found that Holly had been in Zach's car or home. The suspects' families and defense insisted that the entire case was built on a fabrication. They claimed police first coerced Dylan into making a false statement and later did the same with Jason, threatening him with prison time if he refused. Dylan and Jason's stories also didn't fully align. Initially, Dylan claimed he had gone to his brother's house that day to pick up a car and saw Holly and Jason there, but Jason stated he arrived after they'd already put Holly's body in the trunk and even alleged that Dylan had been directly involved in the abduction. There was also another questionable detail. According to investigators, the person who led Holly into the woods was likely Shane, as he was the only one whose height and build matched her brother's description. However, Shane had short, light hair, while Holly's brother recalled seeing a man with long, dark hair. A former Tennessee Bureau of Investigation officer who worked on the case in its early stages shared a few more curious insights. He mentioned that they requested cell tower data to track the location of each suspect's phone, but none of them appeared to be near Holly's house. However, since cell tower data only provides a rough estimate within a relatively large area, it wasn't definitive. The investigators also revealed that they found a palm print on Holly's car that didn't match hers, her family's, or any of her friends. They compared it to all the suspects as well, but none of them matched either. Yet there was no certainty that this print was even relevant to the case. Zach's attorney argued that a much more likely suspect was a man named Terry, whom police investigated during the initial months. As we recall, they questioned him, searched his house, and even placed a wiretap on him, but found no evidence to confirm his involvement. Terry's wife claimed she was home with him that morning while he was installing a new bathtub, but the defense attorney argued that her alibi might have been inaccurate. He said that she was actually at work that morning and that Terry had called her there. Investigators checked with the store where he supposedly bought the tub. They couldn't confirm the sale. Adding to suspicions, right after Holly's disappearance, Terry cut off his long, dark hair. According to the attorney, not only could Terry's wife have faked an alibi for him, but she might have even helped him commit his crimes. Terry had several convictions for assaults on other women, and in some cases, his wife allegedly helped him. Lastly, forensic experts couldn't completely rule out a match between Terry's palm print and the one found on Holly's car. While they could confidently rule out everyone else, they couldn't do the same for Terry. Despite all of this, the prosecution remained firm, insisting that the suspect's guilt was proven beyond doubt, with too many circumstantial factors pointing to their involvement. Jason served only 3 years before being released early, but just a few months later, he was arrested again on weapons charges, putting him back behind bars to await trial. Then, at the beginning of 2024, Jason made an unexpected statement. He claimed that his previous testimony had been fabricated and he never actually saw Holly that day. According to him, he made up the whole story to avoid a life sentence, striking a deal with the police based on lies. Following this, Zach filed a motion for a new trial, but in late September 2024, it was denied. The judge ruled that Jason's statements alone were insufficient to overturn the case, as there were still other circumstantial pieces of evidence against Zach. It's worth noting that at the time Jason recanted his testimony, he was still awaiting trial for his weapons charges. About a month before the judge ruled on Zach's appeal, Jason was sentenced to 19 years in prison. This timing raises questions about his motives. His sudden reversal might have been an attempt to influence his own case and potentially lessen his sentence. As it stands, all 3 men are still in prison, and the only real shot at a retrial depends on whether their lawyers can find new evidence that either clears their names or points the finger at someone else. So far, though, there's been no progress on that front, and the prosecution insists that all 3 are clearly guilty. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A mother put her daughters to bed, but when she went to their room the next morning, one of the girls was missing. The police quickly joined the search, realizing she clearly hadn't left the house of her own accord. Despite uncovering some shocking clues, the search for the answers spanned years. Eventually, detectives managed to unravel the truth, and it was truly shocking. Kirsten Hatfield was born on February 12, 1989, in Midwest City, Oklahoma. The girl's father left the family right after her birth, leading their mother, Shannon, to move to her parents' house. They helped her raise the child, and when Kirsten turned 2, they moved to their own home. Later, Shannon got married again, and her second daughter, Faith, was born. This marriage also didn't last long, leaving the woman to raise her daughters alone. Despite her young age, Kirsten helped her mother take care of her younger sister. Thanks to this, she became very independent and got along pretty well with Faith. The girls shared a bedroom while their mother slept in the next one. On the evening of May 13, 1997, when Kirsten was 8 years old and her sister, 3, Shannon prepared the girls for sleep. Usually, she reads them a story, but this time, Faith had already fallen asleep and the woman didn't want to wake her. She wished her older daughter a good night and went to her bedroom, leaving the door to the girls' room slightly ajar. She did this every night in case either of the girls woke up and called her. Somewhere around 3 a.m., Shannon was awakened by a noise coming from her daughter's room. Thinking the girls had woken up, she went to their room. However, as soon as she reached the corridor and approached the door to their bedroom, the noise stopped. Assuming the girls had gone back to sleep, she decided not to wake them and was about to return to her room. But before she did, something strange caught her eye. The door to the girls' room was completely closed, although Shannon always left it slightly open. She thought one of the girls might have closed the door, or she herself had forgotten to leave it open. Shannon approached the door, opened it slightly, but didn't enter the room, then went back to sleep. The next morning, around 6:30 a.m., Shannon went to wake the girls. She entered their bedroom and found that only her younger daughter, Faith, was in bed. She woke her up and asked where Kirsten was, but Faith didn't know. The woman immediately began searching the entire house, but the girl was nowhere to be found. She looked outside, then called all of her friends, whose children Kirsten was friends with. She hoped the girl had gone to one of them, but they all said they hadn't seen her. After that, Shannon called her father, who lived nearby. Her last hope was that the girl had gone to him, but he also hadn't seen her. Realizing that Kirsten had disappeared, he told Shannon to call the police and went to their house. So, the woman called 911, and officers arrived at the scene within a few minutes. Initially, they thought the girl might have been hiding somewhere in the house or had gone for a walk. In their quiet town, there had never been a case of a child being abducted from their own bedroom, so the local police had never encountered anything like it. However, soon the officers realized the situation was much more serious. Upon inspecting Kirsten's room, they found the window slightly ajar with a few drops of blood on the frame. The police went outside and began examining the area around the window. A few yards away, they discovered a piece of children's underwear on the ground stained with blood. The officers asked Shannon to confirm that it belonged to her daughter, and she recognized it. Investigators realized they were likely dealing with the kidnapping, and more officers were immediately called to the scene. When they searched the area behind and around the house, police questioned the girl's mother. She recounted waking up at 3 a.m. after hearing a noise. Suddenly, she realized that at that moment, an unknown criminal was likely abducting Kirsten. The search around the house yielded no results, and the police started interviewing all residents in the neighborhood. Unfortunately, none of them saw or heard anything suspicious that night. The only lead detectives could gather was that one of the neighbors was awakened by a dog barking around 3 a.m., coinciding with the time of the abduction. Failing to find any solid leads, investigators turned to a child psychologist to speak with Faith. Despite being only 3 years old, she shared that she had witnessed the abduction. However, she kept repeating only one phrase. "A bad person came and took my sister." This once again confirmed that the girl did not leave the house willingly, but it provided no further clues to identify the perpetrator or locate Kirsten. Detectives had to restart the investigation practically from scratch. Their initial suspicion leaned towards someone who knew Kirsten well, as it seemed unlikely that a stranger could abduct her from her own room without a sound. Working on this theory, police discovered that the girl's mother had a history of drug-related problems. The detectives considered the possibility that the abduction might be related to this. Perhaps the mother owed money to some people in the criminal underworld and they decided to take her daughter as payment. The alternative was even more chilling. The police did not rule out the mother willingly handing over her daughter. This would explain why the abduction happened almost silently. They spoke with Shannon, but she denied any involvement. She claimed to have been clean from illegal substances for a long period of time and insisted she would never give away her daughter. Detectives didn't rush to clear her of suspicions, but they couldn't find any evidence to support the mother's involvement. So, the police decided to seek the public's help, reaching out through the media, asking people to share any information related to the case. In the following days, the police department received hundreds of calls, and detectives diligently followed up on each lead. Most of them were quite superficial and lacked any valuable information. However, investigators soon stumbled upon some disturbing tip. A woman called in, suspecting her boyfriend of being involved in a kidnapping. He had been behaving aggressively, even stating during an argument that if she didn't obey him, he would do to her what he did to Kirsten Hatfield. As the police began investigating this man, they uncovered another alarming fact. He was acquainted with Shannon's brother, meaning Kirsten might have known him. Moreover, the girls and their mother lived in a house that previously belonged to her brother, leading the investigators to believe that the suspect might have been familiar with the layout. The man also had a history that brought him into the police's view, including involvement with drugs and even assault. Everything pointed to him possibly being connected to the crime. However, the man claimed he was at a bar that night. Police verified this information and numerous witnesses confirmed his alibi, placing him at the bar until around 4 a.m., eliminating the possibility of him abducting the girl. Following this, investigators pursued hundreds of other leads, but all of them led to dead ends. The case stretched over months, and with each passing day, hope of finding Kirsten alive dwindled. Her mother couldn't just wait and do nothing as the police repeatedly hit dead ends. From the early days, she tried everything in her power to locate her daughter. She gave interviews to the local media, distributed flyers, and even personally investigated various suspects. In her quest for the truth, Shannon faced numerous challenges. For instance, she came up with the idea of reaching out to local businesses in the county, asking them to put flyers about Kirsten in their offices, stores, and establishments. To her surprise, many refused, citing it contradicted company policies. She also attempted to secure a meeting with the state governor, but it was unsuccessful. Shannon also organized a small center with the goal of attracting volunteers to Kirsten's case. They mainly focused on distributing flyers and engaging with the media, but Shannon encountered new problems. Some volunteers stole money, others lied about the work done, and used the media to draw attention to themselves. Despite all of this, she never gave up trying to unravel the truth for many years. At one point, Shannon realized that the current approach wasn't yielding any results, prompting her to take a different path. She enrolled in college, earned a degree in criminology, and became a parole officer. Shannon chose this path not only to find her daughter's kidnapper, but also to protect others from criminals who might be released from prison and still pose a threat. She strongly believed that the person who took Kirsten had other criminal convictions. In her detailed study of individuals with violent pasts in her town and surrounding areas, she attempted to find any connection to her daughter's abduction. However, in the end, all of these efforts yielded no results. At this point, Shannon resigned herself to the likelihood that Kirsten was probably no longer alive and she would never be able to bring her back. Nevertheless, she never abandoned her quest for answers completely. The police occasionally reopened the case, examining new leads, but it yielded no results. In collaboration with the FBI, they even created a sketch of what Kirsten might look like years after the abduction. No one believed she was still alive, yet without her remains, they couldn't declare this with absolute certainty. The stagnation in the case lasted for many years until an unexpected turn of events. In 2014, a woman called the police with a rather bizarre story. Her grandmother had recently passed away, and as she sorted through the remaining belongings, she found a diary. In it, the grandmother detailed how her own son had confessed to killing Kirsten Hadfield. The narrative contains such a wealth of details that detectives had no doubt about the authenticity of the information. According to the diary, the man abducted Kirsten from her bedroom and took her to a nearby town where he owned a house. There, he subjected her to heinous acts and brutally murdered her. The description of the entire process spans several pages, leaving even seasoned investigators horrified. Furthermore, the diary mentioned that the entire ordeal was recorded on videocassette. Detectives immediately brought in the woman's son for questioning. While they anticipated him denying everything, his words surprised them even more. He claimed no involvement in the crime, but knew who committed it because the girl was killed in his ex-girlfriend's house. This perplexed the police, prompting them to ask the man for the address of this house. Detectives swiftly obtained a warrant and sent in a team to thoroughly examine the property. Their first step involved spraying luminol, a substance that emits a glow upon contact with even the tiniest traces of blood, even if it had been cleaned from the scene of the crime. When the forensic experts did this, they were met with genuine shock. One of them later stated that the entire house lit up like a Christmas tree. The chemical revealed that blood was practically everywhere, and most importantly, the blood-stained patterns matched the gruesome details of the murder described in the diary. Experts removed floorboards, cut out sections of wallpaper, and sent out everything to the lab. They also assembled a team for excavations on the property, hoping to find the girl's body. In addition, the police found a box in the house containing hundreds of videocassettes, prompting them to recall the diary. They knew that one of these tapes should contain footage of the victim being abused. Detectives meticulously reviewed each tape, a process that took countless hours. However, none of the cassettes contained anything relating to the murder. The excavations also yielded no results. There were no remains or any evidence in the soil on the property. But then, the detectives faced the most unexpected twist. Experts analyzing the remains of the bloodstains in the house concluded that the blood belonged to an animal, not a human. This came as an absolute shock to the police, as they were convinced they were finally on the verge of solving Kirsten's case. Instead, investigators faced yet another false lead. What this was exactly remains unknown. Perhaps someone decided to play a cruel joke on the police, or the diary was penned by an individual with mental health issues who saw information about the girl's abduction on the news and believed in a narrative being born in their minds. Nevertheless, detectives continued to hope that sooner or later, they would uncover the truth. However, no new leads emerged, and the case once again came to a standstill. In the summer of 2015, Kirsten's case was handed over to a new detective named Daryl Miller, who decided to initiate a fresh investigation. He studied all the existing documents and records, and at some point, he noticed something peculiar. To his surprise, Miller realized that over all these years his predecessors hadn't examined the crucial pieces of evidence, the blood on the windowsill in the victim's room and on her underwear. Although these pieces of evidence were stored in the warehouse for some inexplicable reason, they hadn't been sent to the lab for analysis. Perhaps, back then, the police thought the blood belonged to the girl and analyzing it wouldn't yield any results. Miller decided to rectify this and sent the evidence to the lab. Soon, they called him back, stating that both blood samples belonged not to Kirsten, but to an unknown male. This was a long-awaited breakthrough, but the detective faced a new challenge. The abductor's DNA sample was immediately uploaded to the FBI database, but there was no match. This could mean that he hadn't committed serious crimes, or it happened before the database's creation. Nevertheless, Miller was undeterred. He decided to collect DNA samples from all the men involved in the case since the abduction. The police compiled a list, located each person, and sent their DNA to the lab. Surprisingly, every individual willingly provided their samples right away. This led investigators to consider that the murderer might have not been part of the case files. Despite this, Miller patiently awaited the results until he finally got a call from the lab. Experts had completed the analysis of one of the samples and found that it perfectly matched the blood found on the victim's windowsill and underwear. The individual was 56-year-old Anthony Palma, a neighbor of the Hatfield family who lived just across the street from them. Palma was one of the first people the police spoke to on the day of the abduction. Back then, he told them he woke up around 3 a.m. due to his dog barking. Now, with confirmation of his involvement, detectives decided to speak with him again. While DNA evidence was more than sufficient for a conviction in court, investigators hoped to extract a confession. Firstly, it would significantly expedite the trial, and secondly, only he knew where Kirsten's body was, making it nearly impossible to locate her remains without his cooperation. Detectives chose to proceed cautiously. They invited Anthony for questioning, stating it was a routine process. Supposedly, they were re-interviewing everyone, including neighbors, hoping to gather some new information. In reality, they had a specific task: to get him to admit whether he had ever been inside the Hatfield family home. Initially, detectives asked if he remembered anything else from that night. Anthony recounted the same story as 18 years ago. However, this time he added a new detail. He allegedly saw a white car parked in front of Kirsten's house, but didn't think much of it. Next, the police inquired about his familiarity with the girl and her family. Anthony said he knew them as neighbors but never interacted with Kirsten personally. He added that during those years he got along well with other neighborhood kids. For instance, they occasionally asked him to fix their bikes or stopped by for candy. Subsequently, the police asked if he had ever been inside Kirsten's house. Perhaps the girl's mother had asked him for help or he had visited just to chat. However, Anthony claimed he had never been inside the house while the family lived there. For the detectives, this became a crucial moment for the interrogation. Considering the man's blood was found on the windowsill from the victim's room, they had just caught him in a lie. Thanks to this, in court, he wouldn't be able to claim that the blood got there under different circumstances, like when he visited the neighbors on another day. However, there was a problem. The house where Kirsten lived had previously belonged to Anthony's friend and he admitted to visiting it during those years. But the blood sample on the windowsill was clearly fresh and couldn't have been left there many years ago. However, detectives decided to move on to the main part and informed him that his blood was found in Kirsten's room and on her underwear. Anthony began denying this, repeating that he had never been inside their home. Investigators tried to extract a confession, but he consistently stuck to his denial. Then, they opted to change tactics and left the room. Detective Miller entered to speak with Anthony. He brought along a photo of Kirsten, placing it on the table in front of the suspect. Anthony immediately pushed it away and avoided looking at the photo for the rest of the conversation. Miller asked him various questions, hoping Anthony would eventually slip up, but he continued to deny everything. Realizing they wouldn't extract a confession, the police decided to finish the interrogation and arrested the man. Following this, they obtained a search warrant for his house, thoroughly excavated the entire area, but couldn't find any trace of the girl's remains or any other evidence. During the trial, Anthony persisted in denying his involvement, but the results of the DNA analysis spoke for themselves. In court, additional details emerged that police had overlooked during the initial investigation. It turned out Anthony had prior run-ins with the law. Several years before Kirsten's abduction, he had intruded into another girl's bedroom and assaulted her. He had also been imprisoned in the 80s for a weapon-related attack. This further underscored Anthony's status as a dangerous criminal, but for some reason his past convictions were overlooked in 1997. In late 2017, the jury found him guilty of Kirsten's abduction and murder, sentencing Anthony to life in prison. Throughout the trial, he never revealed the location of her remains, and the police doubt they'll ever find the girl. The problem lies in Anthony's employment with the Park Services. Familiar with remote areas, he could have buried the body where investigators might never reach. Nevertheless, the victim's mother persisted in trying to find her daughter. She regularly called Anthony and visited him in prison, spending hours seeking answers. With each interaction, she felt the criminal was getting closer to disclosing the body's whereabouts, but it never happened. In early 2019, Anthony was killed by his cellmate, driven by personal animosity stemming from Anthony's crime against the child. As a result, the Kirsten family's sole hope to locate the girl's body rests on the chance that hunters or travelers may stumble upon it in remote national parks. A young woman came home and suddenly stopped answering calls. Her family started to worry, and soon the police got involved. Before long, they uncovered a series of creepy and bizarre clues, but figuring out what really happened to her proved impossible for years. That is, until investigators made a shocking breakthrough and finally uncovered an unexpected truth. Carmen Van Huss was born on October 9, 1973, in Indianapolis, Indiana. She grew up there with her parents and two younger brothers. But when Carmen was still a kid, her parents decided to split up. Even so, she stayed really close to her dad and spent a lot of time with him. From an early age, Carmen loved drawing and had a soft spot for animals. According to her parents, she couldn't walk past a stray cat without bringing it home. At one point, she even considered becoming a veterinarian. But later, she changed her mind and decided to follow her passion for art instead. After finishing high school, Carmen went on to study fine arts at Indiana University. To make ends meet, she got a job at Pizza Hut. She didn't want to rely on her parents for money, especially since they already had enough on their plate taking care of her younger brothers. Carmen was in a relationship at the time. And in October 1992, she and her boyfriend decided to rent their first apartment together. They moved into a complex close to her job, and Carmen stayed focused on earning her degree and building a future career in the arts. On March 22, 1993, 19-year-old Carmen went to visit her ill grandmother in the hospital with her dad and brother. She then drove them both home, and her dad suggested she spend the night at their place. It was already late, and her apartment complex was on the other side of town. Worried about her safety, he thought it would be better if she stayed. But Carmen explained that she needed to do laundry to have her uniform ready for her shift at the pizzeria the next day. So she said goodbye to her family and headed back home. 2 days later, Carmen's friends stopped by her workplace, hoping to ask her for help getting a job there. But to her surprise, Carmen wasn't there. After talking to the manager, she learned that Carmen hadn't shown up for her shift the day before. The manager had tried calling her several times but never got a response, so he assumed Carmen had just decided to quit without notice and didn't think much of it. But her friend found this strange. She knew Carmen was a responsible person and had never mentioned wanting to quit her job. She told this to the manager and asked if they had any emergency contacts for her family on file. When Carmen was hired, she had provided her dad's phone number, so the manager gave him a call. Her dad said he had tried to reach Carmen the day before, but she hadn't answered. At the time, he assumed she was busy with work. But now, he was growing worried. Without wasting a moment, he drove to her apartment complex to make sure everything was okay. The first thing he noticed was his daughter's boyfriend's car parked outside the building. Carmen would often drive it, and her purse was sitting inside. He then walked up to her apartment door and saw a note from the building manager. It said that several neighbors had complained about late-night noise coming from her apartment and asked her to keep it down. Her father started knocking on the door, but there was no answer. Soon he realized the door was unlocked. He stepped inside and saw a horrifying sight. His daughter was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, with most of her clothes missing. Shocked, he ran out of the apartment and immediately called for an ambulance. When paramedics arrived, there was nothing they could do. Carmen was already gone. It didn't take long for them to realize that this wasn't just a tragic incident. It was a murder, so they quickly called the police. The investigators started examining the crime scene and began interviewing the victim's neighbors. Noticing a note from the building manager about noise on Carmen's door, they spoke to the manager and found out that several residents had complained about loud noises coming from her apartment on the night of March 22nd. Around 11:30 p.m., the neighbors heard Carmen come home, and from the sound of it, she wasn't alone. There was a man with her. As they walked up to her third-floor apartment, Carmen was laughing, and the man's voice sounded cheerful and calm. Then, around 1:30 a.m., the neighbors heard noises again. But this time, Carmen shouted, "Get away from me." After that, someone ran out of the apartment, and the noise stopped. Even though all of this seemed pretty suspicious, none of the neighbors thought to call the police. The only thing they did was go to the building manager the next morning and complain about the noise. The police spoke to these neighbors and they explained their actions like this. At the time, they all assumed the man Carmen came home with was her boyfriend, so they didn't think anything suspicious was going on. This led the police to believe that she was killed right around the time the neighbors heard her scream. Almost 2 days before her body was discovered. Inside the apartment, investigators found empty food wrappers and a few beer bottles, suggesting Carmen had spent the evening with someone she knew pretty well. She let him into her apartment, spent several hours with him, and only after that did he apparently attack her. Most likely, the crime happened right there in the living room, where they had been sitting and having dinner. There were clear signs of a struggle, like a table flipped over and pieces of Carmen's torn clothes scattered on the floor. Detectives also figured the killer probably went into the kitchen afterward to wash the blood off himself before taking off from the apartment. Medical examiners determined that the victim had suffered over 60 stab wounds from a sharp object and one of her earrings was missing, as if the killer had taken it with him. Carmen had also been sexually assaulted, and experts were able to recover biological material from the perpetrator. However, at the time, DNA analysis wasn't advanced enough and investigators couldn't get a profile of the suspect from the samples they had. After examining all the evidence collected from the apartment, experts also failed to find any traces of the killer's DNA or fingerprints. This left detectives with no leads, no witnesses, and no real clues as to who this mysterious criminal might be. It's also worth noting that nothing of value was taken from the apartment. So investigators ruled out robbery as a possible motive. The first thing police wondered was where her boyfriend had been all this time and whether he had anything to do with the murder. But that theory didn't hold up for long. Detectives found out he was in Arizona, thousands of miles away from Indianapolis. So, with solid proof of his alibi, he was quickly cleared as a suspect. Next, detectives started looking into all of Carmen's friends and acquaintances. Based on the information they had, the motive for the crime appeared to be sexual assault. Because of this, they focused on people Carmen was close to but wasn't romantically involved with. They checked her friends, coworkers, and other people in her life, but none of them could be linked to the murder. With no solid evidence to go on, the police could only hope that someone would stand out, maybe fresh scratches, suspicious behavior, or other indirect clues. But nothing came of it. Carmen's funeral took place a week after her murder. But her family was about to face yet another devastating blow. During the service, as her father stood near his daughter's casket, he received a call from the hospital. Carmen's grandmother had passed away. This was the family's second devastating loss in just a few days. On top of their heartbreak, they were also facing financial struggles and couldn't afford another funeral. Their friends stepped up and organized a fundraiser to help cover the expenses. Thanks to the generosity of others, they managed to pull together the money they needed. In the weeks following Carmen's murder, Police worked tirelessly to find any leads, but nothing panned out. They turned to the public through the media, asking anyone with information about the case to come forward. But unfortunately, none of the tips they received brought them any closer to solving the mystery. The case eventually went cold and stayed that way for years. Detectives would check in on it from time to time. But no matter how many times they looked, they couldn't find any new leads. Carmen's family never gave up fighting for justice. They kept in touch with investigators, gave interviews to local TV stations and newspapers, and begged the public to come forward with any information that could help. But no matter how hard they tried, nothing ever came of it. Carmen's father was never able to return to a normal life after losing his daughter. He spent years seeking justice for her until, in 2002, he tragically passed away in a car accident. After their father's death, Carmen's younger brother, Jimmy, took it upon himself to keep the case alive. He stayed in regular contact with the police, hoping for any updates. But every time, he was met with the same response. They still didn't have a single lead. This dragged on for more than 10 years, with investigators hitting dead end after dead end, never getting any closer to figuring out who the killer was. In 2013, Detective William Carter took an interest in the case. Even though Carter wasn't part of the homicide unit and usually handled other types of crimes, he had a soft spot for cold cases. In fact, he'd even managed to solve one before, all on his own time. Carter reached out to Carmen's family and began digging into the investigation. Since he could only work on it outside his regular job, the process stretched on for months. The first thing Carter did was ask for a fresh analysis of the evidence from Carmen's apartment, focusing on finding any foreign DNA. Forensic experts went back over several items from a trash bag and actually managed to pull some genetic material. But there was a problem. The sample was only partial, so they couldn't pinpoint who it belonged to. The only thing they could confirm was that the DNA came from a man. Then, in 2015, Carter pushed for a DNA analysis of biological samples taken from Carmen's body. He was hopeful that modern forensic technology would finally give them a clear profile of the killer, moving the case forward. But the results from the lab delivered a shocking twist. The DNA from the body belonged to a woman. Carter knew right away something wasn't right. After digging deeper, he found out the lab had made a huge mistake. They'd mixed up Carmen's DNA with the suspect's samples. He asked for a new analysis, but this time the lab refused, claiming they didn't have the funds, even though the error was on them. To make things worse, the police department had already paid the lab $1,600 for the messed up analysis, and there was no chance of getting that money back. The department refused to pay for another round of testing, but Carter wasn't about to give up. He was sure that re-examining the evidence could finally bring justice for Carmen. Determined, he took a bold step. He started a crowdfunding campaign asking the public for help. To show his own commitment, Carter even contributed part of the needed funds out of his own pocket. To his surprise, the response was huge. In just 7 hours, he blew past the fundraising goal. Carter announced that any extra money would go towards boosting the existing reward for information about the case, which was already sitting at $10,000. Carter was ready to request a new DNA analysis, this time with the correct samples. But just 2 days after the funds were raised, he called Carmen's brother with unexpected news. He had been ordered to stop working on the case. While the police department didn't outright say the decision was linked to the crowdfunding campaign, it was pretty clear. The fundraiser stirred up mixed reactions from the public. A lot of people wondered why such a crucial test wasn't being paid for by the department and why regular folks had to foot the bill instead. Still, Carter had no shortage of supporters. When Carmen's brother found out about it, he immediately started a petition demanding Carter be put back on the case. The petition took off fast, grabbing attention from local media and hundreds of upset residents, who started bombarding the police department with complaints. The public outcry was so huge that the department was forced to hold a press conference that same day. They claimed it had all been a misunderstanding and insisted that Carter was never barred from working on the case. To calm the backlash, they also announced that all donations would be refunded and promised to cover the cost of the DNA tests themselves. Eventually, Carter was allowed back on the case and immediately requested a new analysis of the biological samples taken from Carmen's body. This time, the lab took the correct sample and successfully extracted a full DNA profile of an unknown man. But there was yet another setback. The profile didn't match anyone in the FBI's database, leaving the suspect's identity a mystery. Over the next few years, Carter zeroed in on every man Carmen might have known who could have been in her apartment that night. He was sure that the killer was someone she knew, but no matter how hard he dug, he still couldn't get any closer to figuring out who he was. This dragged on until 2023, when the police department decided to bring in Parabon, a company known for its cutting-edge forensic techniques. They opted to try genetic genealogy, a relatively new method that had already cracked hundreds of cases. The process involves taking a DNA sample from an unknown person and searching for their relatives using public genetic databases where people voluntarily uploaded their DNA profiles. Most of the time, the connections are pretty distant, and the people identified often have no idea who the person being traced even is. But even these far-off matches can give experts enough to go on. Once they spot potential relatives, they start building family trees, ruling out people who didn't fit based on age, gender, location, and other details. They keep narrowing it down until they land on the most likely suspect. From there, it's up to the police to get a DNA sample from the person and confirm if it's a match. Given that detectives had made no real progress in catching the killer over all these years, this method was their last hope. Experts got to work, and after several months, they finally identified a man who fit the profile of the murderer. It was 52-year-old Dana Shepard. Investigators found out that at the time of Carmen's murder, he wasn't just living in the same apartment complex, he was right next door. Shepard had a long rap sheet, but most of his crimes were nonviolent. His record included theft, carjacking, driving without a license, and similar offenses, which is why his DNA had never made it into the FBI's database. Detectives also uncovered something shocking. Shepard's name had never appeared in the original case files. For some reasons that remain unclear, the police never considered him a suspect. Maybe they had been convinced from the start that the killer fled the scene, as neighbors reported hearing footsteps running down the stairs, so they never entertained the possibility that the murderer could have been living just a few steps away from Carmen's apartment this entire time. By the time the DNA results came in, Shepard was living in Missouri, working as a janitor at a university. Detectives quickly got a warrant to collect a direct DNA sample from him and made their way to the state. When they showed up at his door with the warrant, Shepard started shaking visibly, but he cooperated and gave them his sample. The sample was rushed to the lab and the results came back as a perfect match. In September 2024, Dana Shepard was arrested and extradited to Indiana to finally face justice. Despite the match, Shepard denied any involvement in the crime and the case has been sent to court. As of now, the trial has not yet begun, but the prosecution believes they have a strong case to secure conviction. According to the prosecutor's version, Carmen knew Shepard pretty well. That evening, he allegedly came over to our apartment for dinner and drinks. Based on neighbors' statements, at some point, Shepard began making unwanted advances, and when Carmen resisted, he attacked her with a knife. Currently, Shepard remains in custody awaiting trial, as he was denied bail. Carmen's brother thanked the investigators for finally naming a suspect, even if it took more than 30 years. Now, he and the rest of Carmen's family are bracing for the tough road ahead as the trial unfolds, a process that could drag on for years. One thing's certain, if Shepard is convicted, he's looking at up to 105 years behind bars. At this point, the prosecution might be holding back some extra evidence that links Shepard to the crime. If it's out there, it'll probably come to light during the trial. But even without it, the DNA match alone could be enough to convince the jury of Shepard's guilt or push him to take a plea deal to dodge a tougher sentence. Share your thoughts on the story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. A young woman headed home after a 4th of July party, but she never made it there. From the very first hours of the investigation, detectives began uncovering a series of troubling and downright bizarre clues. But none of them could have imagined the kind of horror they were about to face. And when the full truth finally came out, this case would go down as one of the most chilling in California's history. Megan Barroso was born on March 15, 1981, in the American town of Camarillo, California. When she was just a little kid, her parents split up, and she ended up living with her mom. But her dad stayed in the picture, seeing her regularly. As a child, Megan got into dancing, and it quickly became her absolute passion. During her high school years, her mom lost her job at the local hospital, forcing them to pack up and move to this small town called Templeton, about 3 hours away. It hit Megan hard. She had to leave behind her school and all of her friends. Right after graduating, she decided to head back closer to home. She rented a little apartment in a place called Moore Park, enrolled in the local community college, and landed a job as an assistant in the purchasing department at a clothing manufacturing company. Down the line, Megan planned to transfer to a university, but she hadn't decided what she wanted to study yet. She was excited to be spending time with her friends again. On top of that, her dad had just gotten remarried and had a newborn son, so Megan made it a point to drop by whenever she could. On July 4, 2001, when she was 20, Megan had plans to spend the whole day with her friends. It was Independence Day, and fireworks were set to go off everywhere in celebration. She started by heading over to her friend Lindsay's house, where her family was throwing a barbecue. Everyone was having a great time, and as evening came, they got invited to a beach party in a nearby town. Megan left her car at Lindsay's place, and their friends came by to pick them up. The party itself was pretty chill. They hung out inside for a while, then headed down to the beach to watch the fireworks. A few hours later, they stopped by another friend's house, and around 2 a.m., they got dropped back off at Lindsay's. Lindsay offered to let Megan crash there for the night since the drive back to her place would take a while, but Megan turned it down because she had to be up early for work the next morning. As Megan leaned in to hug Lindsay goodbye, she accidentally knocked her purse and nearly everything spilled out onto the ground. They both crouched down to pick it all up, but in the mix, Megan accidentally grabbed Lindsay's phone. Neither of them noticed and Megan hit the road. Just a few minutes later, Lindsay realized her phone was missing and figured Megan must have grabbed it by accident. She called her own number from the house phone. Megan picked up, turned the car around, came back to drop it off, and then finally headed home for real. Around 4 a.m., a security guard was patrolling one of the streets in Moore Park, keeping an eye on the local business. At some point, he heard these popping sounds coming from a nearby street and figured someone was setting off fireworks over there. He headed that way and soon enough, he spotted an abandoned car right in the middle of the road. The car was sitting partly on the median, engine still running, driver's door wide open. The headlights and wipers were both on, but there was no sign of the driver anywhere. At first, the security guard figured maybe some drunk partier from the holiday had crashed and just taken off. But then he noticed a woman's flip-flop on the asphalt, and the other one was tucked under the driver's seat. That struck him as weird. Would a woman really ditch the scene of an accident without her shoes? He stepped closer, peered inside the car, and saw red stains everywhere. Realizing it was blood, he quickly stepped back and called the police. The officers started examining the car and spotted a few bullet holes. Most were riddled across the windshield and the driver's side window was completely shattered. With all that blood inside the cabin, at least one of those bullets had to have hit the driver. But the cops immediately picked up on something weird. There wasn't a single drop of blood outside the car. If she'd gotten out on her own, blood would have definitely spilled onto the pavement. So, they figured the shooter might have grabbed the woman who was in there and taken her with them. On the left side of the car, the officers noticed some deep scratches, like another vehicle had sideswiped it. Right by the driver's seat was a purse, splattered with blood. There were no documents or ID inside, but tucked underneath the seat where the purse had been sitting, they found a cell phone, also smeared with blood. While the forensics team combed through the car itself, the police scoured the area for any leads, and it didn't take long to find a few shell casings. Experts quickly determined they came from an AK-47 assault rifle. All of this painted a pretty grim picture for the police. According to the investigators, the woman behind the wheel had probably stopped at a traffic light when the perp pulled up next to her. He rammed her car, and she tried to speed away from him, but the guy pulled out an assault rifle and unloaded on her vehicle. It looked like one or more bullets hit her, causing her to lose control and veer onto the median. What happened next was still a total mystery, but the detectives figured the attacker might have grabbed her and hauled her off in his own car. They also realized her wounds probably weren't fatal, given the relatively small amount of blood in the cabin. While investigators were piecing everything together, the cops ran the plates and discovered the car was a rental. They contacted the company. That's when they learned it had been rented by Megan. The detectives called around to every hospital in the area, but she hadn't shown up at any of them. That only made their theory about her being kidnapped even stronger, but they still had zero leads to point them in the right direction. There were no foreign fingerprints in the car, no surveillance cameras on the road, and at the time it all went down, not a single witness drove by. The detectives headed out to speak with Megan's friends and family. Everyone told them the same thing. They had no clue who could have wanted to hurt her. She wasn't the type to get into fights with anyone. She didn't have a boyfriend or any messy exes. And honestly, she'd never made any enemies in her life. The cops also spoke with Lindsay, who filled them in on everything that happened that day. According to her, she and Megan had a great time. Nothing weird or out of the ordinary happened at all. The only thing that really stuck out to her was this guy named John, whose house by the beach was hosting the party. Lindsay knew him, but it was Megan's first time meeting him. Throughout the night, John kept coming up to Lindsay, asking her to introduce him to Megan, but she kept shutting him down. She told him Megan wasn't the kind of girl who'd be into a quick fling, and that was exactly what John was after. The police questioned him, but the guy swore he never left the party, and everyone there backed him up, saying he was at the house until the early morning. So investigators crossed him off their list and shifted focus back to finding Megan. Police brought in search dogs to check the car, but they only followed her scent a few yards before stopping cold, as if it just disappeared right there. That only fueled detectives' theory that some unknown attacker had grabbed Megan, tossed her into his car, and taken off. Even with all that, police still launched a search around the area where the car was found. Officers hit the streets, combed through the nearby mountains, and checked along the banks of a small river. They even brought in helicopters with infrared sensors to scan from above, but none of it turned up a single lead. Meanwhile, the detectives discovered that Megan's car had this device, kind of like a black box, which logged everything that happened with the vehicle. The cops dove into that data and also brought in ballistic experts to map out the trajectories of all the bullets based on the holes in the car. Putting it all together, they came up with a clearer picture of what happened with Megan. Someone sideswiped her car on the driver's side, and she floored the gas pedal to get away. It seemed like the attacker sped ahead and disappeared out of sight because Megan ended up stopping at a traffic light. Maybe she figured the guy was long gone, but apparently he was lying in wait just up ahead, not far from that light. When she pulled to a stop, he started firing at her car. From what the ballistic expert said, those initial shots missed her, so she hit the gas again. But as Megan drove past the shooter, he fired one more time, and that bullet hit her in the stomach. That's when she lost control and veered onto the median. After that, Megan reached for her phone, which was in her purse. That's what the blood traces suggested. But right then, the attacker walked up to her car, and whatever happened next remained a total mystery. As soon as the details of what happened hit the media, this case blew up as one of the biggest topics in the whole county. People were terrified that some unknown psycho was out there blasting cars with an assault rifle, and they were demanding the police catch him immediately. Officers set up roadblocks to question as many drivers as possible. They were hoping to track down at least one person who'd driven through that morning. But all they found were a handful of folks who'd spotted Megan's car abandoned in the middle of the road. All of them just assumed some drunk had crashed and then ditched the scene. So none of these people bothered calling the cops. The detectives also launched a tip hotline, which got flooded with a few hundred calls. Most led straight to dead ends, but pretty soon, the police got this pretty bizarre lead. An anonymous caller tipped them off, saying that on the morning of July 5th, he'd seen some guy stuffing what looked like Megan's body into the trunk of a burgundy sedan. Moreover, it all went down near these mountains with a seriously bad response. Reputation, where bodies turned up way too often. The detectives rushed out to search that spot right away, and they even released information about the burgundy sedan, hoping to find more witnesses. But in the end, it all came up empty. In the days that followed, investigators hit a total wall. They were starting to seriously doubt they'd ever find Megan alive. Still, they didn't let up. They poured everything they had into the case, chasing down every possible lead. With nothing solid to go on, police went back to Megan's closest friends and family, digging deeper to see if any suspect might have been hiding in plain sight. They even brought in handwriting experts to analyze her work documents, looking for any signs that she might have been stressed or anxious in the days leading up to her disappearance. Even with the dead ends piling up, the cops kept pushing forward with the search, and at one point, they stumbled across a human skull up in the mountains. Experts jumped on it and quickly figured out it belonged to a man who'd vanished the year before. A few weeks after Megan went missing, the police put out a $25,000 reward for information, and later, they rolled out a website dedicated to the case, complete with details and a form for submitting tips. A little while later, investigators brought in a well-known profiler named Sharon Hagen. She'd later go on to help create the movie Zodiac and several true crime shows about killers. After digging through every detail of the case, she concluded that the perpetrator most likely had a sexual motive. But the detectives didn't agree with it. They were convinced it was some kind of road rage incident that just spiraled out of control. Sharon, though, was positive the guy had kidnapped Megan to sexually assault her. What's more, she believed this wasn't his first time pulling something like this, and she even dug up a few other cases that could tie back to the same criminal. 2 years before this all went down, a woman named Joanna was just chilling in her bed when a man in a mask, armed with a knife, burst into her room. He claimed he was a cop and ordered her to strip down completely. Then he grabbed her car keys, shoved her into the passenger seat, and drove her to a park where a blanket was already spread out on the grass. There, he assaulted her, and afterward, he just drove the poor woman back home like nothing happened. Then there was another incident just a few days before Megan vanished. A 22-year-old woman named Donna was walking down the street when out of nowhere, a man dressed head to toe in black jumped out from the bushes. Knife in hand, he forced her to toss her phone into the bushes and get into his car. Right there in the vehicle, he sexually assaulted her, then blindfolded her and took her to some house where he continued assaulting her. After he was done, he actually started comforting her. He promised he'd let her go in time for her morning shift at work and even offered her a soda. Eventually, he drove her back to the spot where he'd grabbed her and even helped her find her phone in the bushes. As soon as she was safe, Donna called the cops and gave them a full description of the guy, but they never tracked him down. Still, the detectives weren't quick to link this to Megan's disappearance, so they kept chasing down any fresh leads they could find. But all their efforts just kept hitting dead ends. Things dragged on like that for a few more days, until the case took this totally unexpected twist. On July 26th, a man from a nearby town called the cops and reported that his neighbor had burglarized his house. Officers arrested 31-year-old Vincent Sanchez and found out he was living with 2 roommates, one of whom owned an AK-47, and Sanchez had easy access to it. That said, the police in this town had no idea about Megan's case, so the fact that he had this kind of rare weapon, something most regular folks don't just have lying around, barely raised an eyebrow. They hauled Sanchez off to jail, where he made a call to one of his roommates and asked for a huge favor. Get rid of this bag he tossed into a dumpster near the house. The roommate figured the bag must have had the stolen stuff from the neighbor's place, since the cops still hadn't recovered any of it. So, he fished out the bag and peeked inside. But what he found was nothing like what he expected. It was packed with a bunch of videotapes. Curiosity got the best of him. He wanted to know why Sanchez was so freaked out about the cops fighting these tapes, so he took them home and popped one in. To his absolute horror, the footage showed tied-up women being assaulted by a guy in a ski mask. The man was talking to his victims and right away, the roommate recognized Sanchez's voice. Some of those videos were even filmed right in the house they shared. The roommate realized Sanchez had been bringing his victims there and he'd had no clue the whole time. Then, he noticed the bag wasn't just tapes. There were several pairs of women's underwear in there, plus a ton of photos of women in explicit poses. He didn't recognize most of them, but one stood out. It was Sanchez's girlfriend, the one he'd been dating for 3 years. In the end, the roommate called the police, and officers showed up to grab the bag. They also searched Sanchez's room, turning up even more photos of women, plus a few pairs of women's underwear and all sorts of female belongings. And that wasn't all. There were knives, a shotgun, handcuffs, and a video camera. So what started out as a simple theft investigation snowballed into something far darker and much bigger. The cops realized that all the women in those videos were Sanchez's victims, and now they had the grim task of figuring out who they were. As the full scale of it sank in, they called in Sharon, the profiler we mentioned earlier. Turns out, she'd already been tracking a serial predator who'd been assaulting women across the city for years, and she'd been studying every one of his victims in detail. There were over 10 of them, and Sharon spotted them instantly on those tapes. She was convinced Sanchez was the guy behind it all, but him wearing a mask in every recording threw a major wrench in the police's work. As she pored over the footage, Sharon caught another creepy red flag. It looked like the attacker had been stalking his victims for a while before striking. He'd casually drop personal details about their lives, like what school they'd gone to, who they were seeing, or where they worked. In trying to connect Sanchez to all these crimes, Sharon thought back to Donna's kidnapping, which went down just a few days before Megan disappeared. Donna had told the cops the guy wasn't wearing any mask at all and gave them a solid description of his looks. Sharon was convinced it was the same creep behind it, so she reached out to Donna and had her come down to the station. There, they set up a lineup with a few men, Sanchez among them. Without a second of hesitation, Donna pointed straight at him and said he was the one who grabbed her. By that point, Sanchez was already staring down a serious prison sentence, but Sharon wasn't done yet. She wanted to prove he was behind every single attack. Then she learned he had access to an AK-47. And since all his crimes revolved around sexual assault, she immediately started to suspect he might also be behind Megan's kidnapping. She tipped off the detectives about this, and they went to Sanchez's place to take a look at the rifle. His roommate, the one who actually owned it, showed it to them, and right away they noticed it was missing the cleaning rod, that thin metal piece that clips under the barrel. The roommate said it had just gone missing, and that's when the investigators realized Sanchez might really be tied to Megan's case. Because a matching cleaning rod had been found near her car, and it even helped prove that her vehicle had been hit with the rounds from an AK-47. From there, the detectives asked the roommate if they could take a look around Sanchez's room. They didn't have a warrant yet, but since one of the housemates gave them permission, they were clear to check it out. Their colleagues had already picked up anything that seemed suspicious, but there was one thing they'd clearly missed. A woman's jacket lying right there on the floor. It matched the one Megan was wearing the night she disappeared. So the officers quickly got a warrant and rushed that jacket straight to the lab. While the investigators waited on those lab results, they sat down with Sanchez's roommates and asked them about his whereabouts on July 4th. According to them, a bunch of friends swung by that evening, and they celebrated Independence Day until around 10 p.m. After that, the guests started heading out, but Sanchez kept knocking back drinks with one of the roommates. Before long, that guy called it a night and went to bed, leaving Sanchez to crash on the living room floor since one of the guests had already taken his room. When the roommate woke up around 2 a.m. to use the bathroom, Sanchez was nowhere to be seen in the living room. 2 hours later, he got up again and Sanchez was still gone. That's when he heard some strange noises coming from outside and looked out the window. To his surprise, there was Sanchez, scrubbing down his pickup truck. It just fell off. Who washes their car at 4 in the morning? The other roommate rolled out of bed around 5:30, and Sanchez was still at it, cleaning his car. Later on, he commented that the truck looked way fresher, especially after he'd shampooed the seats. One roommate's girlfriend noticed a fresh, long scratch on the pickup and asked Sanchez what happened. He brushed it off, saying he'd been caught in traffic and someone had bumped into him. On top of that, detectives talked to Sanchez's best friend, who said that on July 4th, he'd been really down because things with his girlfriend were falling apart. That night, he kept calling her over and over, but she just wouldn't pick up. The detectives then found out that the house of his girlfriend's sister, where a holiday party had been held, was just a stone's throw away from Megan's friend's place. They started piecing together a theory. Sanchez might have headed there, planning to confront his girlfriend. But by the time he showed up, the party was already over. As for the AK-47, they knew he'd thrown around death threats to her family members who tried to talk her out of dating him, so it's possible he grabbed the rifle to scare them. But when he got there, everyone in the house was already asleep. Left alone on that dark, empty street, Sanchez could have spotted Megan saying goodbye to her friend and decided to tail her, leading to the attack. As detectives were piecing everything together, Sanchez, cornered and out of options, finally confessed to assaulting multiple women. With a mountain of evidence stacked against him, he knew there was no escaping it. He admitted to stalking his victims, digging into their personal lives, and even sneaking into their homes to study the layout before abducting them. But when it came to Megan, he flat out refused to admit any involvement. The detectives, though, were almost certain she was dead by this point. And after talking to Sanchez's best friend, they had a hunch about where her body might be. Apparently, Sanchez had once taken his buddy to a canyon and casually mentioned it'd be a great spot to hide bodies. The police rallied volunteers and headed out to search the area. Around 3,000 people pitched in, but the rough terrain made the whole thing a slow grind. Meanwhile, the lab came back with results. They found tiny specks of blood on the jacket from Sanchez's apartment, and DNA analysis confirmed it was Megan's. Using luminol, they also uncovered massive bloodstains in Sanchez's van, but he'd scrubbed it so thoroughly that no DNA could be pulled from it. While they kept hunting for more evidence, the cops brought search dogs to the canyon, and it paid off. One of the dogs zeroed in on a small ravine off the beaten path, and the officers found human remains at the bottom. The body was too decomposed to identify by sight, but they spotted a ring on the victim's hand, identical to the one Megan wore. Later, medical examiners confirmed the victim's identity. It was indeed Megan. They determined she'd been hit by a single bullet that didn't strike any vital organs, but due to the advanced decomposition, they couldn't tell if she'd been sexually assaulted, though they did uncover one chilling detail. She was wearing someone else's underwear. Knowing Sanchez had forced some of his victims to wear underwear he provided, the detectives figured he likely did the same to Megan and probably assaulted her too. At that point, the detectives had enough evidence to take this case to court, but the forensic team dug up even more. While examining the interior of Sanchez's pickup, they found a few specks of glitter. Similar glitter was found in the victim's hair and on her jacket. One of Megan's friends had brought some to the party, and they'd all put it in their hair for fun. The experts studied the glitter under a microscope and found it was pretty rare, hexagonal in shape, with a color that shifted depending on the angle. And here's the kicker. They found an identical piece of glitter on the AK-47 Sanchez had access to. With that, the prosecutor's case got even tighter, linking him directly to the murder. On August 10th, Sanchez was hit with 62 charges, including the assaults on 13 other women, and those were just the cases where the police had solid evidence against him. A few months later, on October 4th, Sanchez tried to plead guilty to Megan's murder, but the judge rejected it over a technicality. Sanchez wouldn't admit to a specific degree of murder or acknowledge any aggravating factors, which was a big deal since the prosecution was pushing for the death penalty. Those details were critical, so he still had to face a full trial. His lawyer argued there was no way the court could sentence Sanchez to death, claiming the prosecution couldn't prove Megan was alive during any assault, which meant they lacked the extra circumstances needed for a death sentence. Even so, the charges stuck and the trial started in 2003. The defense didn't even try to argue his innocence. They just pushed the idea that Sanchez didn't plan to kill her. But the prosecution's evidence was airtight and the jury wasn't buying it. So eventually they found him guilty of first-degree murder. Sanchez got the death penalty, but just 3 years later, California slapped a moratorium on executions. So, he ended up stuck in prison, serving a life sentence where he's been ever since. He's 55 now, and odds are he'll spend the rest of his days behind bars. In the end, this twisted case was finally solved, but investigators still haven't ruled out the possibility that Sanchez had more victims. Megan was likely the only one he killed, but when it comes to the sexual assaults, that question still hangs in the air to this day.